The whispers followed Grace Andrews through town like a shadow that refused to die in the midday sun. Widow at 23, they called her cold-hearted, selfish, the reason her husband drank himself to death. But the truth, like most things worth knowing in Cottonwood Springs, remained buried beneath layers of gossip and spite. The year was 1878, and a woman alone might as well have had a target on her back. Grace kept her chin high as she walked past the general store where Mrs. Hollister and her cronies huddled together, their conversation dropping to hushed tones as she passed. The weight of their judgment was something she'd grown accustomed to carrying, like the basket of eggs and milk she balanced against her hip. "Morning, ladies," she offered politely, though she knew better than to expect courtesy in return. "HMPH," Mrs. Hollister replied, her thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "I hear you're selling that farm your poor husband worked himself to the bone for." Grace paused, the morning breeze catching at her simple calico dress. Can't work it alone, simple facts, no excuses, never could keep a proper home," another woman muttered. "Poor Jeremiah." Grace's fingers tightened around her basket handle, but she said nothing more, continuing her walk toward the post office. The rumors had started even before Jeremiah's body was cold in the ground, how she'd driven him to drink with her cold bed and sharp tongue. How she'd failed to give him children, how she couldn't cook a decent meal if her life depended on it. None of them knew what went on behind closed doors. None of them saw the bruises she'd hidden, the tears she'd shed, the hopes she'd buried. None of them knew she'd spent 5 years trying to love a man who seemed determined to hate himself more with each passing day. The bell above the post office door jingled as she entered, a welcome respite from the scorching Texas sun and even more scorching gossip. "Morning, Grace," said old Mr. Peterson from behind the counter. At least he still used her name, unlike most folks who now referred to her only as the Andrews widow or worse. "Any letters today?" she asked, though she hardly expected any. Who would write to her? "Nothing today, but there is a stranger in town asking about farmhands. Thought you might want to know what with you looking to sell." Grace nodded, grateful for the information. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. He's staying over at Maggie's boarding house. Name's Mitchell Evans. Came in from Colorado territory, I hear." Grace thanked him again and stepped back into the sunlight, her mind turning over this new information. A stranger might be more inclined to pay a fair price for her land, not knowing the stories that surrounded her. Perhaps her luck was finally changing. At Maggie's boarding house, the noon meal was being served. Grace hesitated at the door, knowing her presence would disrupt the easy conversation within. But she needed to eat, and Maggie's was the only place in town that would still serve her without making a scene. When she entered, the dining room fell predictably silent. 10 pairs of eyes turned to her, most quickly looking away. Only Maggie offered a smile, warm and genuine despite the tension. "Grace, honey, come on in. There's stew and fresh bread." As Grace made her way to an empty table in the corner, she noticed him immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, startlingly blue against his tanned skin, followed her with curiosity rather than the usual judgment she'd grown accustomed to. Maggie brought over a bowl of stew and whispered, "That's Mr. Evans. Been asking about good land to buy." Grace nodded her thanks, both for the information and the meal. She ate quietly, aware of the stranger's occasional glances. When he finally stood and approached her table, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle, "I hear you might have land for sale." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I do, Mr. Evans. 100 acres, good water, decent house." "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Please." "Mitchell Evans," he said, extending a hand. "Grace Andrews," she replied, taking it briefly. A whisper from across the room reached them clearly. "Poor man doesn't know what he's getting into. She'll bleed him dry just like she did Jeremiah." Grace's face flushed, but she kept her composure, waiting for the stranger to make his excuses and leave. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and said in a voice only she could hear, "I don't put much stock in town gossip, Mrs. Andrews. I'd like to see this land of yours, if that's agreeable." For the first time in months, Grace felt something stir inside her chest, something like hope. That afternoon, Grace led Mitchell Evans along the dusty road to her farm, 3 miles outside of town. They traveled in silence, he on his chestnut gelding and she on her old mare. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, but Grace hardly noticed, her mind preoccupied with what lay ahead. When they crested the final hill, the farmhouse came into view, a modest 2-story structure with a wide porch and shuttered windows. Beyond it stretched fields gone fallow since Jeremiah's death 3 months prior. "It's good land," she said, breaking the silence. "The north field grew corn better than any in the county last year. The well never runs dry, even in August." Mitchell nodded, his eyes taking in the property with a careful assessment that seemed to miss nothing. "What about that creek I see yonder? Runs year-round, good for cattle watering." They rode down to the house, and Grace felt a familiar pang as they dismounted. Despite everything, this place had been her home for 5 years. She'd arrived as a hopeful bride of 18, certain that love and hard work would be enough. Now she was leaving as a widow, everyone blamed for her husband's demise. "Would you like to see inside?" she asked, tying her mare to the hitching post. Mitchell nodded, removing his hat as they climbed the porch steps. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, one more thing she'd never managed to fix on her own. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Grace had already sold what furniture she could to pay off Jeremiah's debts. What remained was just enough for one person living alone. "It's a solid house," she said, leading him through the main room to the kitchen. "My husband built it himself before we married. You've kept it nice," Mitchell commented, running a hand along the kitchen counter. Grace almost laughed at that. "Most folks in town would disagree with you." Mitchell turned to her, his expression serious. "Why are you selling, Mrs. Andrews, if you don't mind my asking?" The question caught her off guard. Most people assumed they knew the answer, that she was callously disposing of her husband's legacy before his body was even settled in the grave. "I can't work it alone," she said simply, "and there's no one willing to hire on with." She hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "With Jeremiah Andrews' widow, I see." Mitchell's gaze was steady, not pitying but somehow understanding. "And where will you go?" "My aunt lives in San Antonio. She's offered me a place until I can find work." Mitchell nodded, then continued his inspection of the house. In the upstairs bedroom, he paused by the window that overlooked the barn and corrals. "Good setup for horses," he observed. "Are you a horseman, Mr. Evans?" Was a cavalry scout for the army, then tried my hand at ranching in Colorado. A shadow passed over his face. Time for a fresh start. There was a story there, Grace thought, but she didn't pry. Everyone was entitled to their secrets. They finished the tour and stood on the porch as the afternoon began to wane. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, promising relief from the heat. "I'd like to look at the outbuildings," Mitchell said, "and walk the property line if that's all right. Of course, I'll show you." As they crossed to the barn, Mitchell glanced at her sidelong. "Those folks in town, they seem to have strong opinions about you." Grace stiffened but kept walking. "People need someone to blame when bad things happen. I'm convenient." "What happened to your husband, if you don't mind my asking?" "Fell from his horse when he was drunk, broke his neck." The words came out flat, rehearsed. "It happened often enough, the falling, just not the dying part." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. Are you?" Grace looked at him directly. "You didn't know him." "I'm sorry for your loss all the same, and for what followed." They had reached the barn, and Grace pushed open the heavy door. Inside, sunlight slanted through cracks in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. The empty stalls stood in silent testimony to what once had been. "This was a working farm until recently," she explained. "Jeremiah sold most of the livestock to pay gambling debts last winter." She hadn't meant to share that detail, but somehow it slipped out. Mitchell ran his hand along a stall door. "What was your price, Mrs. Andrews?" $2,000. "It's worth more, but I need to sell quickly." He nodded, then looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. "I'll give you $2,500 if you'll agree to stay on through harvest and show me the workings of the place." Grace stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Mr. Evans, I'm new to Texas farming," he continued. "Could use the guidance. I'll pay you fair wages for your time, beyond the sale price." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and a gust of wind blew through the open barn door. Grace felt rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what he was proposing. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked. "You heard what they say about me." Mitchell's expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Andrews, in my experience, when everyone in a town turns against one person so completely, it's rarely that person who's in the wrong." Before Grace could respond, the skies opened up, and rain began to pour. They watched from the barn entrance as sheets of water turned the yard to mud within moments. "We should wait it out," Grace said, moving deeper into the barn. She found a lantern and lit it, casting a warm glow around them. Mitchell nodded, settling himself on a hay bale. "Tell me about the farm," he said. "What grows best here? What challenges have you faced?" And so, as rain drummed against the roof, Grace found herself talking more freely than she had in years. About the farm, yes, but also about her hopes when she'd first arrived. How she'd dreamed of children playing in the yard, of harvests abundant enough to see them through lean times. How none of it had come to pass. Mitchell listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and sharing some of his own experiences. He'd fought in the war as a young man, then scouted for the army afterward. His ranch in Colorado had failed after his partner absconded with their savings. "Seems we've both been let down," Grace observed as the rain finally began to slacken. "Life has a way of doing that," Mitchell agreed. "The trick is to get back up." As they rode back to town in the fresh, washed evening, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of tentative alliance. For the first time since Jeremiah's death, perhaps even before Grace felt she wasn't entirely alone. In town, they parted at the boarding house, agreeing to meet the next day to formalize their arrangement. Grace turned her mare toward the small room she was renting above the milliner's shop, her mind spinning with the day's unexpected turn of events. She didn't notice Mrs. Hollister and her friends watching from the dressmaker's window, their heads close together as they speculated about what business the Andrews widow could possibly have with the handsome stranger. The news that Grace Andrews had sold her farm to Mitchell Evans spread through Cottonwood Springs like wildfire. By noon the next day, the details had been embellished to suggest everything from a shotgun wedding to a sordid arrangement that no decent person would speak of aloud. Grace ignored the whispers as she stood in the bank, watching Mitchell count out more money than she'd ever seen in one place. The bank manager, Mr. Wilkinson, observed the transaction with thinly veiled disapproval. "You understand, Mrs. Andrews, that as a woman you'll need your father or a male relative to countersign for such a large sum," he said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something to a child. Grace felt her cheeks burn. "My father is dead, Mr. Wilkinson, as is my husband. I have no male relatives nearby." Mitchell stepped forward. "Is there a law requiring this or merely bank policy?" Mr. Wilkinson sputtered. "Well, it's customary. Mrs. Andrews is selling property that is legally hers," Mitchell interrupted. "Unless there's a specific law preventing her from receiving payment, I suggest we conclude our business." The bank manager looked from Mitchell's steady gaze to Grace's determined expression and finally sighed. "Very well, but I will make note of my reservations in the record." When they left the bank, Grace's reticule heavy with more money than she'd ever possessed, she turned to Mitchell with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. Most men wouldn't have. Most men should mind their own business," Mitchell said simply. "Now, shall we discuss the harvest plans?" "I'm thinking we should start with the south field." Over the next few weeks, a rhythm developed between them. Grace would arrive at the farm early, often finding Mitchell already at work. They would discuss the day's tasks over coffee on the porch, then set about them with quiet efficiency. Mitchell proved to be a quick learner, absorbing everything Grace showed him about the particular challenges of Texas farming. He hired 2 local boys to help with the heavier work, paying them fair wages and treating them with respect. The townspeople watched this arrangement with increasing disapproval. A widow living alone was already scandalous. A widow working alongside a single man day after day was beyond the pale. Never mind that they were never alone inside the house, that Mitchell continued to stay at the boarding house in town, that their interactions were nothing but proper. One evening, as Grace was preparing to leave, Mitchell looked up from the fence he was mending. "Would you join me for supper in town tomorrow? There are some things I'd like to discuss about the winter wheat planting." Grace hesitated. Dining together publicly would only add fuel to the gossip fire, but she found, surprisingly, that she cared less and less what the town thought of her. "I'd be pleased to," she replied. The next evening found them at a small table at the back of Maggie's dining room. The other diners made little effort to hide their interest, conversations dropping to whispers as serving plates were passed. "You're brave to be seen with me," Grace said quietly after Maggie had brought their food and retreated. Mitchell looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would that require bravery?" "Because association with me has become something of a social liability in Cottonwood Springs." "Then Cottonwood Springs is poorer for it." Mitchell cut into his steak. "These rumors, do they bother you?" Grace considered the question honestly. "They did at first. When Jeremiah died, it seemed everyone turned on me overnight. People who'd been friendly for years suddenly crossed the street to avoid me. It was as if they needed someone to blame, and a widow, especially one who hadn't given her husband children, made an easy target." "What really happened? With your husband, I mean." Grace set down her fork. No one had asked her that, not directly. They'd all assumed they knew. Jeremiah was charming when I met him, handsome, full of big plans. He courted me properly, won over my father. I thought I was the luckiest girl alive when he asked for my hand. She took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "The drinking started about a year in after the first crop failed. At first, just in the evenings. Then earlier and earlier until he could barely function without a bottle nearby." Mitchell listened, his expression somber but not judging. "He gambled, too, lost money we couldn't afford to lose. When I confronted him, She stopped, the memory still raw. "He wasn't always kind when he drank. The night he died, we'd argued about a debt he'd incurred. He stormed out, got on his horse despite being barely able to stand, and rode off. They found him the next morning in the creek bed with a broken neck. And the town blamed you. They said I drove him to it, that if I'd been a better wife, he wouldn't have needed to drink. If I'd given him children, he'd have had a reason to come home sober." The bitter irony of that particular accusation still stung. She'd miscarried twice, both times after Jeremiah's drunken rages. No one asked what it was like living with him. No one wanted to hear that. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm sorry, Grace." "That's not what a marriage should be." The use of her given name surprised her, but she found she didn't mind. "No, I don't suppose it is, though I've little basis for comparison." "My parents had a good one," Mitchell said, his voice softening with memory. "They disagreed plenty, but there was always respect beneath it. My father used to say that the measure of a man was how he treated those who depended on him. Your father sounds wise." "He was." Mitchell's smile held a hint of sadness. "He and my mother both died of influenza when I was 17, but I've tried to live by what they taught me." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished their meal. Mitchell told her about his time in Colorado, the beauty of the mountains and the harshness of the winters. Grace shared stories of her childhood in East Texas, where her father had been a schoolteacher before moving the family west. As they stepped out into the evening air, Grace felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her burden had diminished its weight. Mitchell offered to walk her to her lodgings, and she accepted, aware of the curtains twitching in windows as they passed. At the stairs leading to her rented room, she turned to thank him for the meal. The moonlight caught the planes of his face, and for the first time she allowed herself to acknowledge how handsome he was. "I enjoyed our conversation," she said, suddenly shy, "as did I." Mitchell hesitated, then added, "Grace, I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying through harvest or leaving sooner, I'll abide by it. The farm is mine now, but your life is your own." His words, so different from any she'd heard from a man before, touched something deep within her. "Thank you, Mitchell. I'll see you tomorrow." As she climbed the stairs to her lonely room, Grace found herself wondering if perhaps her aunt's offer in San Antonio wasn't the only path forward after all. The harvest proceeded under an unforgiving sun. Grace worked alongside Mitchell from dawn till dusk, her skin browning despite the bonnet she wore. Together they brought in the corn and wheat, stored what they'd keep, and arranged for the sale of the surplus. The farm was coming back to life under Mitchell's care. He'd repaired the sagging porch steps, patched the roof where it had leaked for years, and even fixed the squeaking floorboard in the main room that had driven Grace to distraction. More than the physical repairs, though, was the change in the atmosphere of the place. For the first time since she'd arrived as a bride, the farm felt peaceful. There were no angry shouts, no sound of breaking glass, no tense silences that stretched for days. Just the rhythmic work of two people building something together. The town's opinion of their arrangement, however, only worsened. When Mitchell began accompanying Grace to Sunday services, sitting beside her in the last pew, the minister himself saw fit to deliver a sermon on propriety and the dangers of ignoring social conventions. After one such service, Grace and Mitchell walked back toward the center of town, their path taking them past the general store where Mrs. Hollister and several other ladies were gathered on the porch. "Shameless," one of them said loudly as Grace and Mitchell approached. "Parading around town together as if we don't all know what goes on at that farm." Grace felt Mitchell stiffen beside her but placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It's not worth it," she murmured, but Mrs. Hollister wasn't finished. "Poor Jeremiah must be turning in his grave, seeing his wife carry on with another man before he's cold in the ground." Mitchell stopped walking, his expression darkening. "Madam," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you do well to mind your own affairs." Mrs. Hollister drew herself up indignantly. Everyone knows she was a bad wife to Jeremiah, drove him to drink with her cold ways, couldn't even give the man a child. Something snapped inside Grace. 5 years of silence, of bearing blame, of turning the other cheek, it all came to an end in that moment. "You know nothing about my marriage," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Nothing about the bruises I hid, the money he gambled away, the nights I spent terrified in my own home. You saw what you wanted to see and made me the villain of a story you didn't understand." A stunned silence fell over the porch. Mrs. Hollister's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. "Grace has shown me nothing but kindness and hard work," Mitchell added, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "She's the only good thing I've ever known in this town. And I won't stand by while you slander her name." With that, he offered Grace his arm, which she took with trembling fingers, and they continued their walk, leaving the ladies staring after them in shocked silence. Later, at the farm, Grace sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mitchell settled beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn," he said after a moment. "I know you've managed their gossip on your own all this time." Grace shook her head. "No, I'm grateful. No one's ever defended me before." She turned to look at him, studying his profile in the fading light. "Did you mean it? What you said about me being the only good thing?" Mitchell met her gaze, his blue eyes earnest. "Every word. Grace, I know it hasn't been long, but I've come to care for you, more than I thought possible." Her heart quickened. "Mitchell, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know you're still healing, that you have plans to leave. I just wanted you to know that if you were to consider staying, well, there would be a place for you, not as my farmhand, but as my partner, in all things." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a hope she'd long since abandoned. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted softly, "but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of making another mistake, of trusting and being wrong again." Mitchell nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's fair. I'm not asking for an answer now, just for you to think about it." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Grace felt as though she stood at a crossroads, the path ahead unclear but somehow less frightening than it had been before. That night in her small rented room above the milliner's shop, Grace thought about what it might mean to stay, to build a life with Mitchell Evans, to trust again. She thought about the gentle way he spoke to her, how he listened when she talked, how he never raised his voice even when things went wrong. She thought about the respect in his eyes when she showed him how to mend a harness or plant a row of corn. And for the first time in years, Grace Andrews allowed herself to hope for a future that held more than mere survival. The next morning, Grace awoke to an insistent knocking on her door. When she opened it, still tying her robe, she found Maggie from the boarding house, her round face flushed with exertion from climbing the stairs. "Grace, you need to come quick. There's trouble at the saloon." Grace's blood ran cold. "Mitchell," Maggie nodded grimly. "Jeremiah's brothers rode in last night. They've been drinking since, making threats." Mitchell went to get supplies and they cornered him. Grace dressed hastily, her fingers fumbling with buttons and laces. Jeremiah's brothers, Seth and Caleb Andrews, were cut from the same cloth as their younger sibling, charming when sober, vicious when drunk. And they'd never approved of Jeremiah's marriage to Grace, considering her beneath their family's standing. By the time she reached the saloon, a crowd had gathered outside. She pushed her way through, heart in her throat, to find Mitchell standing with his back to the wall, facing the two Andrews brothers. Seth, the elder, had a pistol trained on Mitchell's chest. "You stole our brother's land," Seth slurred, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "Took advantage of his widow before he was even cold in the ground. The land was legally hers to sell," Mitchell replied evenly, though Grace could see the tension in his stance. "And I've shown Mrs. Andrews nothing but respect." Caleb Andrews spat on the ground. "Respect ain't what the town's been talking about, mister. They say you two been living in sin out at that farm." "That's a lie," Grace said loudly, stepping forward despite the murmur of the crowd. "Mitchell has never spent a night at the farm. He stayed here at the boarding house, as everyone knows." Seth turned his bloodshot eyes to her. "Well, if it ain't the grieving widow herself. Didn't take you long to find a replacement for our brother, did it?" "Your brother was a drunk who beat his wife," Mitchell said, his voice hard. "You want to shoot me for saying so, go ahead, but leave Grace out of it." The crowd gasped at Mitchell's blunt words. Grace saw Mrs. Hollister among them, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Seth's face contorted with rage. "You're calling my brother a wife-beater, I'll kill you where you stand." "No," Grace moved between them, facing Seth with more courage than she felt. "If you want to shoot someone, shoot me. I'm the one who sold the farm. I'm the one who failed your precious brother, but Mitchell is telling the truth and deep down you know it." She stared into Seth's eyes, unflinching. "Jeremiah came home drunk most nights. He spent our money on whiskey and cards, and yes, he hit me. Often. The whole town pretended not to see the bruises, just like they're pretending now that you're doing anything but defending a man who didn't deserve defending." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Seth's hand wavered, the pistol dropping slightly. "She's lying," Caleb said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "She ain't," came a new voice from the crowd. Sheriff Taylor stepped forward, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "I pulled Jeremiah out of more bar fights than I can count. Warned him about laying hands on his wife more than once, too." The sheriff's admission seemed to break a dam. Suddenly, others were speaking up. "I seen her with a black eye last Christmas," said Mr. Peterson from the post office. "Jeremiah owed money all over town," added the livery stable owner. "Was gonna lose that farm one way or another." One by one, the townspeople who had turned their backs on Grace began to acknowledge the truth they'd ignored for years. Mrs. Hollister looked stricken, her earlier certainty crumbling before Grace's eyes. Seth Andrews slowly lowered his gun. "Is it true?" he asked Grace, his voice hoarse. "Did he really hurt you?" Grace nodded, feeling no triumph in the moment, only a profound weariness. "Yes. And I stayed anyway, because that's what a wife is supposed to do. But I won't apologize for selling the farm after he died. I won't apologize for finally wanting something better for myself." Sheriff Taylor stepped between them. "Seth, Caleb, I think it's time you boys headed back where you came from. There's nothing for you here." For a tense moment, Grace thought Seth might raise his gun again, but then his shoulders slumped and he holstered the weapon. "Come on, Caleb," he muttered. "This ain't worth the trouble." As the Andrews brothers shuffled toward their horses, the crowd began to disperse, many avoiding Grace's eyes, shame written clearly on their faces. Mitchell moved to her side, his hand gentle on her elbow. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Grace took a deep breath. "I think so, it feels strange, after all this time, to have the truth known." Mrs. Hollister approached them hesitantly, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine contrition. "Mrs. Andrews, Grace, I owe you an apology. We all do." Grace looked at the woman who had led the campaign against her for so long. "Why?" She asked simply. Why was it so easy to believe the worst of me? Mrs. Hollister's eyes filled with tears. I don't know. Perhaps because it was easier than admitting we should have helped you, that we failed you as neighbors and friends. She twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. I am truly sorry, Grace nodded, not quite ready to forgive but acknowledging the apology all the same. Thank you for saying so. As Mrs. Hollister walked away, Mitchell turned to Grace. Would you like to go home? Home. The word hung in the air between them, full of meaning and possibility. Yes, Grace said finally. I would. They rode back to the farm in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the morning's events. When they reached the house, Mitchell helped Grace down from her mare, his hands lingering at her waist. I thought I might lose you today, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace looked up at him, seeing the fear still lingering in his eyes. I couldn't let them hurt you, Grace. Mitchell took a deep breath. I know it's soon, I know you've been hurt, but I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day in the barn when you spoke so honestly about your dreams for this place. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. Mitchell, you don't have to say it back, he assured her quickly. Just know that I'll wait. However long it takes for you to be ready, if you ever are. Grace reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his cheek. I don't want to wait, she whispered. Life's too uncertain for waiting. And then she was in his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of hope and healing and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace felt as though something long frozen inside her had finally begun to thaw. Stay, Mitchell said, his forehead resting against hers. Not just through harvest, stay for good, marry me. Grace smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt foreign on her face after so long. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. The autumn days grew shorter, the morning air crisp with the promise of winter to come. In the small white church of Cottonwood Springs, Grace Andrews stood before the altar in a simple blue dress, wildflowers in her hair and joy in her heart. Beside her, Mitchell Evans looked at her as if she were the sun itself, his eyes full of a love she was finally learning to trust. The pews behind them were filled with townsfolk, some who had always believed in her, like Maggie and Mr. Peterson, and others who were only beginning to make amends, like Mrs. Hollister. As they spoke their vows, Grace felt the weight of the past finally lift from her shoulders. The gossip had faded, replaced by a tentative respect as the town came to terms with its role in her suffering. It wasn't perfect forgiveness. Grace wasn't sure such a thing existed, but it was a start. I now pronounce you man and wife, the minister said, and Mitchell kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. As they walked down the aisle together, husband and wife, Grace caught sight of Mrs. Hollister dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The older woman gave her a nod of genuine goodwill, which Grace returned with a small smile. Outside, the autumn sun bathed the world in golden light as the newlyweds climbed into the wagon that would take them home. Their home now, truly theirs together. Happy. Mitchell asked, his arm secure around her waist as he took up the reins. Grace leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. More than I ever thought possible, she answered honestly. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mitchell's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, Grace marveled at how completely her life had changed in just a few short months. What are you thinking? Mitchell asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. That sometimes the worst endings lead to the best beginnings, she replied. That I never would have met you if Jeremiah had lived. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, his fingers idly stroking her arm. When I came to Cottonwood Springs, I was just looking for land, a place to start over. I never expected to find you. They said I was a bad wife, Grace mused, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. Mitchell tightened his arm around her. You're the only good thing I've ever known, he said firmly, the only thing worth having in this whole world. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace Andrews Evans believed him. Spring came to the farm in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. Grace stood at the kitchen window, her hands resting on her swollen belly, watching as Mitchell worked in the newly planted vegetable garden. 6 months of marriage had only deepened their bond. each day bringing new discoveries about each other, new reasons to be grateful for the life they were building together. The town had gradually accepted their union, the old gossip fading as new dramas took its place. Mrs. Hollister now nodded politely when they passed in town, and several of the ladies had even contributed to the quilt that now graced their marriage bed. Grace smiled as Mitchell looked up, catching sight of her in the window. He waved, his face breaking into the grin that never failed to quicken her heart. She waved back, then moved to the door as he approached the house. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her stomach. "Your son is kicking up a storm," Grace corrected with a laugh. They'd been playfully disagreeing about the baby's gender for months. Mitchell bent to kiss her, his lips warm against hers. "We'll know soon enough," and they would. Their child was due in just a few weeks. A spring baby to be born into a home filled with love and respect, everything Grace had once despaired of ever finding. As they sat down to their noon meal, Grace reached across the table to take Mitchell's hand. "I never thanked you," she said quietly. "For what? For believing in me when no one else did, for seeing beyond what the town said about me." Mitchell turned her hand over in his, tracing the calluses that spoke of hard work and determination. "I didn't do anything special, Grace. I just saw you for who you are, and who is that?" She asked, curious about how he would answer. His eyes, clear and blue as the spring sky, met hers without hesitation. "The strongest, kindest, most honest woman I've ever known. A woman who endured years of hardship without letting it break her spirit. A woman any man would be proud to call his wife." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, happy tears, the kind she'd cried more often in these past months than in all the years before. "I love you, Mitchell Evans. And I love you, Grace Evans, more with each passing day." As summer turned to autumn again, and their son, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, grew strong and happy, the old gossip about Grace Andrews faded to a distant memory. In its place grew the story of Grace and Mitchell Evans, of a love that had defied the judgment of an entire town, of a bad wife who had turned out to be the very best thing that had ever happened to a lonely cowboy looking for a place to call home. And in the years that followed, as their family grew and the farm prospered, Grace would sometimes think back to that day in the saloon when the truth had finally come to light. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet gratitude for the path that had led her, however painfully, to where she was meant to be all along. On their 10th wedding anniversary, with 3 healthy children playing in the yard and the farm more successful than it had ever been under Jeremiah's care, Mitchell presented Grace with a locket containing miniature portraits of their family. "10 years ago," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "I rode into Cottonwood Springs looking for land and found my heart instead." Grace touched the locket, warm against her skin. "And to think, if you'd listened to the gossips, we might never have had this." Mitchell cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. "I told you then, and I'll say it again now, you're the only good thing I've ever known, Grace Evans, the absolute best thing that ever happened to me." And as he kissed her, their children's laughter floating on the summer breeze, Grace knew with absolute certainty that the whispers had been wrong. She hadn't been a bad wife, she'd simply been married to the wrong man. With Mitchell, she was exactly who she was meant to be, loved, respected, cherished. Not perfect, but perfectly matched to the man who had seen her true worth when no one else would look beyond the gossip to find the truth. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of her past, a family, a home, a love story that would be told in Cottonwood Springs long after the old scandals had been forgotten. And in the end, that was all that mattered.